Hello everyone, Darcy Bono here. In this video we're going to look at the new rule set for Warcry 2.0. And just to clarify, we're going to be addressing the overall game mechanics and not the restructuring of how the campaigns run. That is a video unto itself. So this is just going to be about the basic gameplay. So without much further ado, let's get started with the perhaps biggest addition to the game, the introduction of reactions. So essentially the way reactions work is you use any actions your fighter has available to them, whether they haven't activated at all and they have 2 actions left, or whether they've been waiting and have only 1 action left. You can use those actions to perform one of the things in this chart during an enemy fighter's activation. The easiest way to think about it is that you use up any actions you have available to your fighter when you do a reaction. Your actions essentially become ammo for your reactions. Let's say, for example, you're attacked twice by an enemy fighter. If you have 2 actions available to your fighter, let's say you haven't activated at all, you can choose to counter each of those enemy attack actions. But that being said, your fighter is done for that round. He won't be able to activate again because he has used up his actions to do reactions. So let's take a quick look at some of the reactions you can do. So counter is essentially an enemy fighter takes a swing at you, and before your opponent rolls their dice, you have to declare, hold up, I'm going to try and counter you. And then when your opponent rolls their attack dice, any attacks that miss actually result in damage to your opponent. So think of it like boxing. When a fighter throws a punch and it misses, they then open themselves up to a counter punch from their opponent. Now, this might seem like a great way to do a ton of damage to your enemy when it's not even your turn. However, keep in mind that by doing this counter reaction, you are foregoing a future attack action from your fighter. So if you have a very heavy hitting fighter, you don't really need to do this. You're more likely to do more damage to them when it's your turn. So keep that in mind. It's fun and it's funny, but keep in mind there are more ideal times to use this. The main one that springs to mind is if your fighter has very low health and probably isn't going to survive the attack from the enemy, you're probably going to want to go ahead and just use your actions as reactions, counter those attacks, try to get in the damage while you can, since you won't be alive to use those actions later. Next, we have take cover. It's pretty self-explanatory and exactly how it sounds. If one of your fighters is in cover and then becomes the target of a missile attack, which is a ranged attack, anything over 3 inches, before those hit rolls are made, you say, hold up, I'm taking cover, I'm using a reaction to take cover. Your opponent will then roll their hit roll dice, and any critical hits that occur, you then roll a d6 per critical hit, and on a 4 up, that critical hit is negated down to a regular hit, which is huge and shatteringly disappointing for any sniper fighters, those wonderful guys like the long strike that shoot for 410, that crit for 10, that is then negated down to just 4. So I could certainly see this being helpful in an objective secured situation where you've got your guys in position, you're not planning on going anywhere, you just need to hold the objective, but you're receiving enemy ranged attacks. This is a great way just to stay put and mitigate any ranged attack damage to your fighters. And finally, there is strike them down, which is by far my favorite. This is used whenever an enemy fighter tries to disengage. I'm particularly excited about this because my husband plays very elusive, very mobile warbands, and this will help put them in their place. Whenever an enemy fighter goes to disengage, you can say, hold up, I'm going to try and strike you down, and roll a dice. On a 4 or greater, you can allocate d6 damage points to that enemy fighter, which is fantastic because, in theory, you could crank out 6 damage onto a fighter that you might not be able to get a hold of again. But, that being said, there's a 50% chance that this will miss. If you roll a 1 to a 3, you've just wasted an action, essentially. Or, you might be able to get that 4 up, but then you roll a d6 and the d6 is a 1. So, it's a very flavorful Warcry mechanic where it's very swingy, but ultimately very fun. And speaking of disengaging and fighters that are hard to catch, let's take a look at the new treasure mechanics. I will be the first to tell you I absolutely loathed the previous treasure carrier rules. It was so easy just to scoop up a treasure and go blazing off in the distance with it. You could win the game easily off just sheer mobility. It just wasn't fun. So what they've done is substantially mitigate the amount of movement a treasure carrier can do. Fighters with the Monster and Beast rune mark can no longer carry treasure, which is fantastic because you won't have Aether Wings picking up treasure and flying all over the map. And perhaps more universally awesome is the fact that a fighter now carrying treasure has -2 to their movement per move action. So -4 inches of movement to the total distance a fighter can move during their activation. And perhaps even better than that, you can no longer fly while carrying a treasure. So no more squig hoppers bouncing all over the place, no more crypt layers flying off with treasure when they're 30 wounds. Yes, I'm very salty about some things, but I'm very happy about this change. And finally, and perhaps the most important of all, a fighter with treasure cannot make a disengage action. So if your opponent is able to close the distance and get into engagement range 1 inch of your treasure carrier, you need to use your treasure carrier and the other fighters in your warband to try and take out this threat. Otherwise, your treasure carrier is not going anywhere. So I feel that all of these updates together are going to give a much more gratifying, a much more appropriately bloody treasure scenario within Warcry than what we've seen in the previous edition. Next, we'll look at a major change to the warband composition. In the previous edition, you could have one fighter with the leader rune mark. That's the skull with the 8 prominent points sticking out from it. And I do regret to inform you that the rune mark's appearance have not changed. They still look very similar to one another. So while the appearance of the leader rune mark has stayed the same, it has actually changed its name to the hero rune mark. Changing the name from leader to hero seems a little arbitrary, but it does help clarify how to include character models within your warband. So basically how it works is that you can now include up to 3 fighters that have this hero rune mark. And one of those 3 hero fighters has to be your leader. And the leader has to be obviously from your faction. That stays the same as in the previous edition. So for example here we have the Dark Oath Chieftain on the left from the Slaves to Darkness as my leader. In the center we have a Kitbashed Chaos Sorcerer, also from Slaves to Darkness, so he is considered just a hero, not the leader. And then finally we have the Dark Oath Slaughterborn from the new Dark Oath Savagers. He is not part of the Slaves to Darkness, he is his own Dark Oath warband, so he is considered an ally. And now according to the core rules, no special gameplay required, no glory points needed, you can include all 3 of these in your warband. And you can in fact have up to 2 allies. You don't have to do the leader hero, then the regular hero who's in your faction, and then the ally who's not in your faction but it's in your Grand Alliance. You could do Dark Oath Chieftain supported by a Slaughter Priest supported by a Doom Bull, which is bananas when I say it out loud. As a painter, I love this because now I love painting hero models, so now I can include more of those in basic gameplay without having to do a campaign or any kind of open play. This is now legitimate. From a player's perspective, this is going to open the door to some pretty over-the-top combinations when you look at the different abilities of what each hero can do. Some very interesting, potentially fun synergies, but I have a feeling this might end up getting a little abused. Another change is the composition of battle groups. Previously, 1/3 of your warband had to be in your shield, but no more than half could be in any of the other battle groups. They've since simplified this by saying you just have to split up your battle groups as evenly as possible. So if you have a warband consisting of 6 Stormcast, each of your battle groups is going to have 2 fighters in them. If your warband consists of a number of fighters that is not divisible by 3, that's totally fine. Still split them up as evenly as you can, and you do get to decide where to put the odd man out. I personally am not a fan of this change because I liked being able to put my high HP fighters, things with 20 or 30 wounds, in a battle group by themselves, because with that amount of wounds to work with, you could generally survive on your own. And then I would put my chaff in my shield around my leader, but now it seems like I'm going to have to split up my chaff units between each of these battle groups, thus reducing their effectiveness as chaff. There's also been several important changes to falling off of terrain. My favorite of this is now you have to take a fall test anytime you are attacked when your fighter is within half an inch of an edge. Prior to this, it was you had to take a fall test upon a critical hit. So the attacker had to roll a 6, and you had to roll a 1 in order to fall. Now the probability of you falling is significantly greater because it's whenever you incur an attack action and you're within half an inch of an edge. So a key target isn't going to be able to just sit comfortably on top of terrain taunting people quite as much as they used to. And speaking of falling off of things, impact damage now occurs at 2 inches of vertical movement downwards instead of 3. This does include jumping off of stuff, falling off of terrain. There are 2-inch tall platforms in the new box set, so that has now been factored in. This also affects your ability for when someone is on top of terrain taunting you. The good old use an action to climb up, use your second action to hack at their ankles. If you had to climb up 2 inches in order to reach them, which in all likelihood you probably did, you can now potentially suffer impact damage when you fall back down when your activation ends. And finally, regarding fall damage, for some reason they decided to switch the scale, to reverse the scale at which impact damage is received. So originally it was on a 1 to a 3, you stick the landing, nothing happens. On a 4 to a 5, you hurt yourself and take 1 damage. And on a 6, you really need some ice and you take 3 damage. That is now completely reversed. A 1 gets you the most damage, and a 4 to a 6, a 4 up, means you stick the landing. So I'm not sure why they did that. It just is one more thing to remember for the people that have played before, but oh well. And finally, we have reached the miscellaneous changes category. These are essentially important updates that didn't really have their own paragraph I could put them with, essentially. The most important being this: you can no longer shoot into combat. So essentially it's just like in 40k, you can no longer fire a ranged attack at an opponent who is already engaged with one of your friendly fighters for fear that you might hit your friend. Which is so ironically courteous for such a cutthroat, bloodthirsty, chaosy game, but I get it, it balances things out. Like I said, this is already a thing in full-scale Warhammer, so it makes sense. However, it does kind of reduce the usefulness of archers, so I'm assuming their points cost will be reduced. Mounts can now actually climb stairs. So that's fun. You can ride your noble steed up onto terrain, wreak havoc, and then dramatically jump off and possibly twist their ankle. Another rules update is now you roll off for attacker and defender before you draw any of your gameplay cards. So you no longer will know your deployment or your victory condition prior to deciding who is attacker and defender. So this definitely adds a variable of randomness, and honestly you would probably just decide this based on your preferred gameplay style. Also, games can now painlessly end in a draw. There's no more beating around the bush, playing round after round, trying to achieve the victory condition. If once all of the battle rounds are over, if neither team has achieved the victory condition, the game's a draw. There's also no more desperate last stand. This was the relatively rare scenario in which you only had one fighter left alive, and instead of only being able to perform one ability, you could do as many abilities as you had the dice to perform. I really don't think removing this is going to affect hardly anything. I've played a ton of Warcry and have seen this very rarely, and in the cases I have seen it, it's been when both warbands have a very low model count. Finally, and I do hesitate to put this even in here, I think they removed chaotic beasts. And I say I think because I've gone through the core book multiple times and I cannot find a description of them anywhere. And then I went and looked through the battle plan cards and they're not in there in the twists either. So I think they've removed them, or maybe they've moved them into the campaign section somewhere and I've just somehow missed it. But for now, I'm going to say that chaotic beasts don't exist in this, which is weird because this takes place in Gur. So yeah, at the risk of sounding like an idiot, let me know if you find where they've put the chaotic beasts or whether they've just deleted them entirely. Maybe they're releasing them with the compendium points update. I know you can include thralls, so you can include the, Furies and the birds whose name I never remember as your thralls, but I don't see any of the good old random game-wrecking chaotic beasts anymore. Alright, so those are all the major changes I've noticed within the book. Let me know if I missed anything, and thank you very much for joining me. This was my very first rules-based video, so let me know what you think of that, as well as the rule set itself and how you think that's going to affect the game. But thank you, I hope this was relatively coherent and enjoyable to watch. If you did enjoy this video, please remember to like and subscribe, as it does help me out greatly. And until we meet again, happy gaming!